Welcome to Pusey House. You're all sitting in the Chapel of the Resurrection. My name is George Westaver. I'm the principal here. It's wonderful to have you all here today. The event today is being put on by the Centre of Theology, Law and Culture here at Pusey House and the Iain Ramsey Centre in partnership also with Exeter College. Iain Ramsey Centre is supported by the University of Warsaw and the John Templeton Foundation. This is the first part of a day-long colloquium happening tomorrow. Unfortunately, there are no more spaces at the colloquium, but that will take place at Exeter College. Thank you to Charles Foster for organizing that. If you're moved to support this yourself, there's a donation machine here in the center. I don't have the same gift of saying that as eloquently as you do, Dr. Price, but if I evoke your spirit, maybe that will help. At the Pusey end of things, Dr. Jonathan Price, the Metragic Fellow, lay fellow here at Pusey House in St. Cross, and Dr. John Ritsema, researcher and administrator at the Centre of Theology, Law and Culture, have helped to put all this on today. It's a real pleasure to welcome Dr. Iain McGilchrist. I will be very brief so that we get to listen to him more. He is a consultant psychiatrist, a writer, philosopher, has inspired many people. He was a former prize fellow at All Souls College, and the author in particular of The Master and His Emissary and The Matter with Things. The Master and His Emissary, one of those seminal books that changed the way people think about the relationship of psychiatry and philosophy and cultural studies. I was particularly grateful because you helped me to argue that the allegorical or typological interpretation encouraged by the Autre movement is knit into the matter of things. So that's what I now tell people. I point to you as inspired of my own research. The talk he will be giving this afternoon is called Dominus, illuminatio mei, Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Future of the University. We welcome Dr. Iain McGilchrist.
Much for those kind words. I hope people can hear me clearly. Thank you to Pusey House and Exeter College for inviting me to talk to you today. I propose to talk for an hour, and then there will be time for a few questions. A few months ago, I had a dream. I was at a party in what was clearly, as it is with dreams, part of the Bodleian Library. A beautiful room with huge Gothic windows opening on the street. While we were all chatting and laughing, I noticed that a torrent of water was moving swiftly outside and had already reached halfway up the gigantic windows. I thought, there's no way these flimsy window panes can hold back this weight of water. I saw that we and
Yes, please.
I have a lapel mic. I'm not supposed to be using this one.
Lapel mic's for the video.
You don't want to use the lapel mic?
No, it's for the video recording. Lapel mic's for the video. This is for the...
So I need to be here. I heard a terrible echoey thing. Shall I start again? I think I will.
The echo is, you'll hear it, but they'll hear you fine.
On the recording it will be fine. A few months ago I had a dream. I was at a party in what was clearly, as it is with dreams, part of the Bodleian Library, a beautiful room with huge Gothic windows opening on the street. While we were all chatting and laughing, I noticed that a torrent of water was moving swiftly outside and had already reached halfway up the gigantic windows. I thought, there's no way these flimsy window panes can hold back this weight of water. I saw that we and everything in the room, with its cases of fine old books, would within seconds be swept to destruction. My fellow partygoers not only seemed entirely oblivious to the water, but when I drew their attention to what was going on outside the windows, were unperturbed and insisted that everything was fine. They carried on laughing and sipping their cocktails. I, however, left. Today I will offer some reflections on the future of the university, not merely or mainly this university, but the universities of the West in general. My main concern is what I consider to be the drifting away from, a neglect, even an abandonment of the pursuit of truth, the pursuit that is ultimately the only justification of a university. I'm not speaking only of the truth intended by our forebears when they chose as the motto of this university, Dominus illuminatio mea, though I do mean that as well, for according to their way of seeing things, truth of all kinds emanated from and was illuminated by the sacred nature of its source. Truth is a searing, searching matter, not to be dismissed at convenience. The truth I see abandoned is of many different kinds. For that reason, to the casual observer, each might seem unrelated to the others, but they are related, and insight into what makes them all cohere, indeed makes each of them inevitable, comes, as I shall explain, from understanding an aspect of the way in which the brain constructs the world. I remember when I was 17, hearing the most profoundly affecting speech of my life. I can still see the radio set in my parents' kitchen as I listened to it enrapt. Solzhenitsyn's Nobel acceptance speech entitled One Word of Truth. I assume it must have been voiced by an actor, as this man who had suffered every kind of evil in the attempt to break his will and destroy his humanity was not able to deliver the speech in Stockholm in person. The effect on me, in any case, was electrifying. The title, we are told, is from a Russian saying, "One word of truth outweighs the whole world," a saying which, of course, had ineffable weight in the context in which it was being delivered. It spoke of those who had grown up indoctrinated in a system of lies, built on lies, lies that were so blatant that the only way to maintain them was to punish severely those who in any way challenged them or even demurred at them. Of course, at the time, I realized how very fortunate we were that we lived in a quite different society where discussion was free and where there were no questions you could not ask. But that was then. For over 2,000 years in the Platonic and later the Christian world, the tradition of Western thought, human life was seen as orientated towards three great values: goodness, beauty, and truth. Each of them in turn seen as a manifestation of an aspect of the sacred. During my lifetime, I have seen each of these important values, along with the sacred, repudiated and reviled. Less and less attention is given these days to the inner nature of goodness as a disposition towards the world. Too often it seems that goodness has been reduced to rule following and good actions determined by a form of bloodless utilitarian accountancy. Beauty is dismissed as irrelevant in an era that respects only one value, namely power, so that no artist now wishes his or her art to be praised for its beauty, only for being powerful. And truth is dismissed, inevitably, as part of the rhetoric of power, supposedly decreed at whim to suit those who hold the power. Everyone, it is argued, is entitled to their own truth. What are we left with? Our only value seems to be the self-centered one of utility. But as Lessing pointed out in the 18th century, the utilitarian has to answer the question, useful for what? The question points onwards to the necessity of other values beyond those of mere power to manipulate. Without such further and greater values, we flounder, set adrift in a chaotic and meaningless world where our best bet would be to make our solitary, poor, nasty and brutish lives at least as short as possible. As it turns out, this question of value, and particularly that of truth, leads us to consider what is known about lateralization in human brain function. I'm not going to spend time on the evidence here. For one thing, it's far too extensive, and for another, I've laid it out elsewhere for those who wish to examine it at leisure in great detail in two long books, The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, published in 2009, and a more recent book, The Matter with Things, Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World, published in 2021. I'm going to go straight to a characterization of some of the core findings, so please forgive me if these are lacking in finesse. To some extent, that is inevitable for present purposes, as I'm sure you will understand. In a nutshell, each hemisphere has evolved for Darwinian reasons to pay a different kind of attention to the world. The left hemisphere has evolved to pay narrow beam attention, focused piecemeal on a detail that we already know and desire and are intent on grabbing and getting, whether it be something to eat or to use in some other way. The left hemisphere exists in the service of manipulation. The right hemisphere, meanwhile, is on the lookout for everything else that is going on while we're intent on manipulation. For mates, conspecifics, offspring, and predators, so as not to be eaten while eating. Its attention is broad, sustained, coherent, vigilant. The right hemisphere is in the service of understanding the whole context, which is nothing less than everything else in the world. The difference then is not, as used to be supposed, to do with what each hemisphere does, so much as the way in which it does it. Each hemisphere is involved in everything we do, just in a consistently different way. The hemispheric difference in attention is not disputed. Indeed, it is universally attested. And since the nature of attention also indisputably changes what it is that comes to our attention, such a difference cannot but lead to two different phenomenological worlds. What are these two worlds like? Very briefly, if crudely, they could be characterized like this. In the case of the left hemisphere, a world of isolated, static things. Things, moreover, that are already known, familiar, predetermined, fixed. Of bits, fragments that are decontextualized, disembodied, meaningless, abstract, generic in nature, fungible, infinitely reproducible, quantifiable, mechanical. Useful then, but ultimately bloodless and lifeless. This is indeed not so much a world as a representation of a world, which means a world that is actually no longer present, but reconstructed after the fact. Two-dimensional, schematic, theoretical. And here the future is a fantasy that remains under our control. In the case of the right hemisphere, by contrast, there is a world of flowing processes, not isolated things. One where nothing is just fixed, entirely certain, exhaustively known, or fully predictable, but always changing and ultimately interconnected with everything else. Where what exists are wholes, of which what we call the parts are an artifact of our way of attending. Where what really matters is implicit, and must remain so, a world of uniqueness, one where quality is more important than quantity, a world that is essentially animate. Here, the future is a product of realism, not denial. This is a world that is fully present, rich and complex, a world of experience which calls for understanding, not a representation designed to submit reality to our manipulation. Naturally, we're not aware of this disjunct because these worlds are combined at a level below our awareness. We become aware only after an accident of nature, such as a stroke, tumour, or injury, or after commissurotomy, the so-called split brain procedure, or if one hemisphere at a time is experimentally suppressed. Then they may become suddenly, vividly present to us. Yet because these two worlds have mutually incompatible properties, when we come to reflect consciously on the world and to rationalize about it, we're forced by the requirements of consistency to choose between the pictures of the world they offer. This is why, as Iain Whitehead observed, well, I thought he did. Is there some other way? Oh, no, that's wrong. Well, you missed Solzhenitsyn, but you know. Here's the master in his hemisphere. Ta-da-ta-da, here is a Bouverie. And there is White. Oh, I see the asterisks. Oh, there we go. This is why, as Iain Whitehead observed, this is a very important point. A culture is in its finest flower before it begins to analyze itself. When our lives become very largely mediated by self-reflexive language and discourse, as in our postmodern world they are, we can no longer rely on the wisdom that comes from closeness to the long tradition of a society, to nature, and to the sacred, from narrative, myth, and ritual, from poetry, music, and drama, to sophisticate our understanding. Unfortunately, the two hemispheres are not equally veridical. In terms of our ability to apprehend, take hold of, and use the world, the left hemisphere is superior. But in terms of our ability to comprehend the world, the right hemisphere is superior. In each of what one might call the portals to understanding, attention, perception, judgment, emotional and social intelligence, cognitive intelligence, in other words, IQ, and creativity, the right hemisphere is so much superior that the left hemisphere is on its own, has been repeatedly described as frankly delusional. That is not a rhetorical expression. Denial of the facts and delusional beliefs are far commoner in association with damage to the right hemisphere, and consequently dependence on the left hemisphere, than the reverse. On its own, the left hemisphere confabulates, makes up stories so as to fit with its beliefs. It will frankly insist that the paralyzed limb is unaffected, or, if challenged, deny that the offending appendage belongs to the subject at all. It's yours, doctor. Unlike the right hemisphere, which sees more than one angle and has for this reason been called by V.S. Ramachandran. Oh, hello, I've got the hang of this, but only just. No, I haven't got the hang of it. There we go. There's my friend, Ramachandran. The devil's advocate, the left hemisphere doesn't doubt that it is right. Sorry, I'll read that sentence again. Unlike the right hemisphere, it sees more than one angle and has for this reason been called by V.S. Ramachandran the devil's advocate. The left hemisphere doesn't doubt that it is right. It's never wrong and never at fault. Someone else is always to blame. Furthermore, in what I take to be the four important onward paths towards truth, science, reason, intuition, and imagination, though both hemispheres contribute, the crucial part in each case, including in science and reason, is played by the right hemisphere, not the left. Our predicament is that we now live in a world the understanding of which is largely limited to that of the inferior left hemisphere. Some signs of this include our inability to see the broader picture, the way in which wisdom has been lost, understanding reduced to knowledge, and knowledge replaced by information, tokens, or representations, the loss of the concepts of skill and judgment, the divorce of mind and matter, resulting in a strong tendency to simultaneous abstraction, and the debasement of matter to mere lumpen matter for our exploitation, an exponential growth of bureaucracy and administration, everywhere the proceduralization of life, the reduction of justice to mere equality, a loss of the sense of the uniqueness of all things, the supplanting of quality by quantity, the abandonment of nuance in favor of black and white judgments, the adoption of simplistic either-or positions, the loss of reasonableness, which is replaced by rationalization, a complete disregard of common sense, the design of systems not for humans but to maximize utility, deterioration in social cohesion, a growth of paranoia and pervasive mistrust, for if all is not under its control, the left hemisphere becomes anxious and projects its anxiety outwards onto others. Nonetheless, we play the passive victim and abjure responsibility for our own lives. In addition, I might point to the rise of anger and aggression in the public sphere. Like almost everything that used to be said about hemisphere differences, the idea that the left hemisphere is unemotional is wrong. The most highly lateralized emotion is anger, and it lateralizes to the left hemisphere. And there are more indications, but for today's purpose, I'll stop there. I believe it is this intellectually jejune and morally bankrupt approach that has resulted in what has been called the meta-crisis, the destruction and despoliation of the natural world, the fragmentation and polarization of society, a surge in mental illness, a rise in violent crime, and so on. How does all this relate to what I see as the dereliction of truth? There are four main reasons, I think. One I have referred to, the quite literally less veridical, borderline delusional nature of the world constructed by the left hemisphere, the one that now provides our dominant narrative and mode, that of the machine. The second is that for the left hemisphere, the map is mistaken for the territory. The thinness and seductive simplicity of theory comes to trump the richness and complexity of experience. The third is related to this, in that the left hemisphere, unlike the right, prioritizes internal consistency with its model over contrary evidence from life. And the last I have mentioned, each hemisphere has different priorities. The left hemisphere evolved so as to be principally in service of utility and power, so as to grab and get, exploit and manipulate. The right hemisphere goes beyond to those other values that answer the question, utility for what? Values, therefore, such as goodness, beauty and truth, which are, in my view, not just the necessary foundations of a functional society, but the grounds of human flourishing. Indeed, elsewhere I argue that it is our capacity for love and our capacity to respond to those values and help nourish them that explains our coming into existence at all. It is the reason for the being life. This left hemisphere dominance is inevitably played out in its own way in the university, the realm of teaching and research. I will turn my attention to four areas: to the humanities, to science, to our sense of the divine, illuminatio nostra, and to the much more worldly realm of university management. Finally, I will reflect on where this leaves not just the universities, but our civilization as a whole. First, to clear away a misconception. In speaking of truth, I want to distance myself equally from two popular false alternatives. On the one hand, naive realism that there just is a world out there that it's our duty to record passively, as if we were Geiger counters or photographic plates, and naive idealism, the view that we make up reality and are therefore free to do so in any way we wish. Each of these travesties misses the important perception that truth is an encounter. There is then no one absolute truth about the world that results from every encounter alike, but there are certainly truths, some things we believe to be truer than others. In the humanities, we should be used to the idea that truth is of this nature. We speak of a musical performance that's truer to its subject than another, a critical interpretation of a work giving a truer account than another, and we expect at least a degree of consensus on the matter among those who know enough to recognize a good interpretation when they hear one. There are very clearly better and worse interpretations. As a critic of Hamlet, though no one account is exclusively correct, I could get it indisputably wrong. For example, by claiming the play is really an account of peasant life in Azerbaijan in the 10th century. There being no single fixed truth absolutely does not mean there is no truth. Without truth, we would have no reason to do or say anything at all. Even the statement that there is no truth is a truth statement. Because the left hemisphere is concerned with power, its narrative is always about power. You will notice this all around you nowadays. It was perhaps inevitably in the humanities that things started to go wrong. Marxist theory, popular in universities in the 60s and 70s, held that truth was merely whatever version of things the ruling class found to suit its own interests. Soon this allied itself to deconstructionism. The insight into the partial truth, that for us truth must always remain partial, quickly morphed into the dogma that since the experiencer inevitably enters into the experience is simply made up, a complete non sequitur. These beliefs were much in the air when I was an undergraduate reading English in Oxford in the early 70s, and I found them not only simplistic but grim. Great literature, it seemed to me, was an awe-inspiring gift that, if treated with respect and approached in a generous spirit, offered to open to us hitherto unknown realms. What was valuable in the poems and books we read, of whatever age and from whatever culture, was precisely their unforeseen nature, their characteristic uniqueness, and the nuances that couldn't be translated into prose without loss. Subtleties that could so easily be crowded out by the crude assumptions of the critic. The fashionable isms, I believe, move in exactly the opposite direction, towards the Procrustean bed of the explicit and theoretical, to the sameness of our foregone conclusions, to our self-righteousness, and to the self-importance of the critic. Since those days, Marxism and deconstruction may have become less strident, but there has come into being something on a far greater scale, an array of politically motivated factions, each with its own way of avoiding reading literature and riding roughshod over it. These factions instrumentalize art for their own purposes. With astonishing hubris and abundant pettiness, we sit in judgment on our ancestors as though we were, by definition, wiser than they. We measure them against our checklist that we've drawn up representing the parochial outlook of the last few decades. That list has no historical antecedent and is in opposition to most wisdom traditions around the world. We imagine we are superior because we are blind to many things that they could see. Education is about enlarging, not narrowing the mind. As is well known, the Greek word for truth, aletheia, means unconcealing. This process, however, is a concealing. I'm not a historian, but clearly the same considerations apply to the study of history. There can be no one history, of course, but historians are not thereby excused from the obligation to be as true to all the known facts as they can be. Without this in place across the humanities, there would seem very little point in having university courses devoted to them. It would seem once every view is thought equally defensible, none is valuable any longer. It goes without saying that the only thing worse than every view being thought equally valuable is when all views are deemed wrong apart from one, a position to which we are growing ever nearer if we have not reached it already. I believe this must play a part in the decline in application of university places across the humanities. Not the only part, of course, since future employment prospects play their part too. But the mention of employment prospects raises a question. Why has a degree in the humanities, much favoured by employers in the past, lost its prestige? I suggest two reasons. One is that our culture, if it is still a culture, has turned its back on the humanities in general, part of what I see as the exclusive elevation of a kind of procedural learning devoted to the technical processes over a more imaginative, but certainly no less important, intellectual engagement with the realm of ideas. Once such a process is underway, it creates a positive feedback loop which threatens to see the humanities wither away altogether. Well, that would leave universities, or indeed the civilizations of which they form a pillar, is not something it is possible to contemplate with equanimity. The other reason is that there has undeniably been a lowering of standards, the students coming less fully prepared from school, so that much work formerly undertaken at school has to be done at university, coupled with grade inflation, an easing of demands for rigour, thoroughness and careful scholarship, and the abandonment of scholarship altogether in the face of a demand for relevance, issuing in the rash of studies courses of various kinds that are little more than indoctrination, their conclusions being foregone. Understandably, fewer and fewer intelligent people want to take part in this parody of education. What I'm not saying is that we need more fixed truths, but quite the opposite. We need fewer. The humanist approach, while it holds to truth, is thoroughly opposed to indoctrination with dogma. The fashionable isms, however, move towards, not away from, dogma. What is happening here is that a way of breaking out of the prison of our own preconceptions, what education is about, is being traded for ever more pervasive incarceration, since all ways of questioning the approved narrative become not just off-limits, a calamity in itself, but so far off-limits that anyone who attempts to question any part of the narrative is inviting reputational annihilation and personal vilification. I note en passant the emotional timbre of the left hemisphere: anger, disgust, narcissism. In our world, wrote Orwell in 1984, there will be no emotions except fear, rage, triumph, and self-abasement. There will be no laughter, except the laugh of triumph over a defeated enemy. Yet this is, of course, the antithesis of education. No educated person should be unwilling to engage in civil, respectful discussion. To quote Solzhenitsyn's words at Harvard in 1978, it's a universal law. Intolerance is the first sign of an inadequate education. An ill-educated person behaves with arrogant impatience, whereas truly profound education breeds humility. Moreover, it seems to me obvious that the weaker the case, and the more unbelievable the position, the greater the vehemence and the greater the threats which need to be brought to bear in an attempt at enforcement. Solzhenitsyn, again. Violence can only be concealed by the lie, and the lie can be maintained only by violence. Violence does not always necessarily take you physically by the throat, strangle you. More often it merely demands of its subjects that they declare allegiance to the lie, become accomplices in the lie. And the simple step of a simple, courageous man is not to take part in the lie, not to support deceit. Let the lie come into the world, but not through me. Science might appear less open to the belief that truth is what we choose to make it, but it's clear that this is no longer the case. Without freedom to collect evidence and evaluate it patiently and carefully, we can't be sure of the full extent of censorship in science. But for those who want to... why does this thing not have... But for those who want to read an even-handed account of the part played by censorship of all kinds, I recommend a paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in November 2023 by Corey Clark and colleagues. They consider three kinds of censorship. First, overt censorship, double standards, the branding of unimpeachable findings that would cause us to cast an intelligently skeptical eye on sacred cows as poor science or pseudoscience, blocking their publication. It's more responsive when I... blocking their publication. And then second, covert censorship, ostracism of, denunciation of, denial of, promotion to those that are dissident, meanwhile failing to challenge misleading research as long as it honors the sacred cows. And third, perhaps the most important, self-censorship in science. The authors of this report say that nearly all US scientists report self-censoring their empirical beliefs somewhat to fit in with a socially correct agenda. To me, this is to undermine the very strength of science and the justification for research, which is to promulgate what is empirically found to be the case, regardless of whether it confirms our prejudices. Censorship has no place in science. In the end, it will defeat its own purpose by undermining the credibility of science. And without that important touchstone of unbiased empirical evidence, we have cut away one of the supports, perhaps the most important support, on which a humane society is based. Uncomfortable facts or realities that do not corroborate whatever theory is currently enjoined are particularly important if we're to make any progress in our understanding of the world. If nothing is allowed to correct a theory, we're doomed to live by lies. What at first sight may seem paradoxical is that science is threatened both by inappropriate subjectivity on the one hand, and by an unsustainable belief in a kind of objectivity that modern physics has long discredited on the other, the kind that assumes that the knower plays no part whatever in knowledge. Truth is never objective in this artificially limited sense, but important as it is to recognize that fact, it's every bit as important to validate science's attempt to respond fairly and fully to the reality with which it engages. That is where true objectivity lies. And along with this, I should mention the model of the machine, which still, alas, dominates in the life sciences, though abandoned long ago, at least 100 years ago, by the science of the inner, physics. There are signs, thank goodness, that this is at last giving way in the face of fascinating revolutionary observations which reinforce an already unassailable body of evidence, at least a century old, that organisms are nothing like machines. For those who are interested, this is something I've written about at some length in The Matter with Things, and have discussed in a number of conversations with Michael Levin, distinguished professor of biology at Tufts and director of the Centre for Regenerative and Developmental Biology there, who is one of the most important minds in the field of biological development now. The paradox of being too swayed by inappropriate subjectivity on the one hand and by an inappropriately rigid model on the other is only apparent. It emerges out of a polarized position, one which neglects the understanding of truth as a relationship in which we are not at liberty to make up the terms any way we want, but which imposes on us the sacred demand that we be at all times honest about and honourable to the world we are seeking to know better. Dominus illuminatio nostra. Up till now, I've been talking about the adverse consequences of the politicization of the humanities and science. In relation to the divine, the problem of a left hemisphere-dominated approach obscuring the truth is less political and more to do with the way in which we misunderstand all that cannot be readily reduced to laws and language. If you can recall some of the main differences between the kinds of woe sustained by the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, I think you will see what I mean. The left hemisphere world is characterized by what is familiar and fully expressible in language. The right hemisphere is more open to and attentive towards whatever is other and can be only indirectly expressed. The left hemisphere is less capable of Keats's negative capability, being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. It is thus relatively incapable of the tentative, careful, as Heidegger would say, fürsorgend, reaching out towards what lies beyond what we think we already know. Where the left hemisphere sees things in isolation, the right hemisphere sees processes that are relational. Indeed, its disposition towards the world helps us see that relations are, as I argue, prior to relata. It sees relations in which both parties are inevitably changed. It is alert to what I call betweenness, the importance of context, exemplified by the nature of music, in which the individual notes only become what they are by their being in relation to all the others. It sees that decontextualization and explicitness destroy the nature of whatever lies in a web of interconnectedness. It sees that our understanding has to be participatory, and that the soul and body are not opposed, but discernibly different aspects of one reality. It is better at holding together apparently conflicting positions, whereas according to the left hemisphere, nothing can be separate and connected, precisely measurable and intrinsically imprecise, immanent and transcendent at the same time. Indeed, the right hemisphere is less likely to ignore, simply not see, whatever does not fit the paradigm it already holds. Further, the right hemisphere's understanding of knowledge and belief is experiential, not a simple matter of information in the abstract or acquiescing in dogma. It helps us to see that belief, I remind you that the root of the word is love, is a matter of dispositions, not propositions, and of unconcealing, not correctness. The word truth is cognate with trust. The right hemisphere understands metaphor, myth, narrative, drama, music, and poetry, all of which are commonly hard to understand when there is right hemisphere damage. The richness of these implicit paths to knowledge, which also include ritual, is intrinsic to any spiritual understanding. Finally, the right hemisphere is less willful than the left hemisphere, and therefore more open to relinquishing control. It can understand the value of what in Buddhism is called emptiness, and the part played by negation in creativity, the power of silence and stillness, of not knowing and not doing, of withdrawing in order to permit something truly other to manifest itself the first time. It is the substrate of the mature self as opposed to the immature ego. It can understand that suffering can be generative, and it can understand the valor in vulnerability, and the dark side to what we think is merely good. None of this makes sense to the reductive materialist, and this is another reason, and another sense in which the left hemisphere leads us away from the truth of the divine. But there are still other paths in the abandonment of truth, darker than those we have discussed. In a world dominated by left hemisphere modes of being, two important developments could be predicted to proliferate. Administrative control, evident in the decline of every civilization, and machine learning. Both depend on algorithmic paths that are linear and sequential, the kind of thinking that neglects context and the existence of Gestalten, wholes that cannot be reduced to their parts, and substitutes group characteristics for individual uniqueness. It also doesn't understand attachment to place and tradition, literally the handing down of hard-earned wisdom. Indeed, it can have nothing to do with wisdom at all, or the body and its emotions, or the realm of the soul. A kind of thinking, in other words, that is biased towards machines and against human life. After the war, Theodor Adorno saw developing all around him what he called die verwaltete Welt, the administered world in which everything was controlled, proceduralized and devitalized. One where a new form of total control had taken root in the form of a self-legitimizing bureaucracy. He quoted the Austrian writer Ferdinand Kürnberger, "Life no longer lives." Who does not recognize with a chill this diagnosis of the modern human predicament? And he points out that it's not even the triumph of the logical, since administration serves to rationalize the irrational, which explains why its workings and outcomes are often deeply unreasonable. I believe we are witnessing nothing less than a war on nature and a war on life. This, my friends, is the reality we face. Why? Partly hubris, the short-sighted view that we can do anything we want and remake the world to suit our demands. So nature, apparently, stands in our way. But there's more to it than this, and it has to do with the goals and values of the left hemisphere. As Whitehead said, Descartes assumed the mind can only know that which it has itself produced and retains in some sense within itself. Of course, Whitehead didn't know about hemisphere differences, but here he describes precisely a key characteristic of the left hemisphere. It knows only what it itself has made, representations, not real presences. It wages active war on the living world, not created by it, seeing it as a rebuff to its mastery. Hannah Arendt wrote of what she called the future man, that he seemed possessed by, quote, a rebellion against human existence as it has been given, a free gift from nowhere, secularly speaking, which he wishes to exchange, as it were, for something he has made himself. The German-American artist George Grosz produced a shockingly vivid expression of this power-hungry mindset as he contemplated Europe before the Second World War, entitled, "I shall extinguish everything around me that restricts me from being the master." Turning again to administration, of course it has a legitimate role in any institution. However, it comes at a heavy price, both literal and metaphorical. And if the institution is to flourish, to remain creative, to allow individuals to give of themselves freely and spontaneously, as in my experience, the best teachers and researchers do, it needs to be as light in its touch as possible. When I was in the university, it did its job properly. It was almost invisible. It's not an end in itself, as it seems sometimes now to have become, but a necessary evil. To quote William James, most human institutions, by the purely technical and professional manner in which they come to be administered, end by being obstacles to the very purposes which their founders had in view. It goes without saying that it inevitably slows and prolongs processes, makes them more cumbersome, causes imagination to atrophy and thinking processes to sclerose, results in inaccuracy, injustice, and a waste of time, and requires a great number of what are now called resources, namely people, as well as buildings and machinery that are expensive. It gives the mediocre unexpected power over the talented, and favours those who are not trained or experienced in doing what the institution exists to further, be it a hospital, a school, or a university, over those who are. My mentor, the so-called father of neuropsychiatry, Professor Alwyn Lishman, a profoundly scholarly and modest man, was asked by a manager to justify why he had requested a head scan of a patient in what was the country's quaternary referral unit. He reflected that when he had to account for his actions to a bureaucrat, it was time to retire, and he did. The humane teachers and tutors from whom I learned in the humanities would rather have retired than submit to the exercises in political retraining and box-ticking that would be required of them now. They would see them as part of the problem that they, as educators, were trying to redress. All this is patronizing and damages initiative and morale. It is a growth that ultimately threatens the viability of its host. And the proof of this in the case of the university is escalating costs that are a burden to students or the taxpayer and result in recruiting wealthy students from around the world that can afford the fees, a sense of fear and conformity in what should be a place where ideas are free to be explored, and a fall in applications, especially among those groups that this very expensive new bureaucracy is in place to discriminate against. But what is happening is that three interlocking left hemisphere manifestations are at work. First, there's the failure to believe in truth in the humanities, and now even in science, unless it conforms to the preferred narrative. Then there is the expansion of administrations everywhere to ensure that all appearances confirm this narrative. And third, the advent of more sophisticated AI that both monitors our speech and actions and produces simulacra of real human thought. AI finds its natural home in organizations whose desire is ever greater control of other human beings. Quite apart from the many ways that AI can be used to infringe our liberty and to make possible totalitarian control of a kind never heretofore seen, how on the simple daily level will we be able to assess the ability of an individual student or the achieved standard of their work when AI can be relied on to write an essay? How will we assess the evidence in court? And with the humanities and science dying out of the pursuit of truth, how will any of us in future know what to believe about anything at all? If you ask ChatGPT to answer a question, it does a trolley dash around the internet and comes up with a vanilla milkshake. What is prominent on the internet is not necessarily truer than what is not. And as more and more of what goes to prominence on the internet turns out to be generated by machines like ChatGPT, how can we ever escape this hall of mirrors to find a glimmer of truth. There is no imagination, that sacred faculty here, only fantasy, the liar. The casualties in this world are many. The honour and self-belief, as well as the credibility of societal groups that are being, often without their consent, promoted, is compromised, and they're patronised by being held to lower standards than others. Unjust suspicions may attach to individuals who've succeeded through their own valiant effort, suspicions which cannot easily be disproved. The honour and self-belief of social groups that are disfavoured, where the scales are tipped against them, is compromised. They become resentful of being reviled for being who they are, feel the smart of injustice, and become demotivated. Universities are or should be centres of excellence. Instead, the left hemisphere mentality of administrators seems to wish to remake them in its own pedestrian image, as it is also doing in hospitals and schools, with widely damaging effects. I speak from experience. We now have difficulty recruiting nurses, doctors, teachers, and police. Principally, I believe, because they see the institutions in which they would work as having comprehensively lost their way. We cannot afford not to have the very best pilots, surgeons, engineers, and soldiers. Why would we be willing to have the less than best thinkers, teachers, and scientists? We live in an increasingly dangerous world, one where if we are to survive at all, and especially to maintain and defend a free society, we need to regain a truer understanding of our history and values, to regain some self-respect, and promote and rely on only the very best people. Instead, we appear to be actively finding ways of doing the opposite. You may be sure that the totalitarian regimes that may one day subjugate us have no intention of handicapping themselves in this way. We even reward particularly those who would attack the tolerant society that therefore is so easy to attack. Once it has been gone, this tolerant society, be sure that we will all be, how to put it adequately, worse off. Iain wisely warned that a loss of faith in institutions is a precursor to totalitarianism, and if people are losing faith in them, I think I can see why. Freedom of speech is historically rare and precious, the result of battles fought and sacrifices made by our ancestors over many centuries. As Iain put it, this society no longer knows of those higher and more meaningful activities for the sake of which this freedom was won. Whatever some people may say, I believe racism and sexism are racism and sexism. Injustice can't be fought with injustice, only with justice. This was the burden of Martin Luther King's most famous speech. In all this process, we see the same inversion of meaning in language that other far-sighted individuals, Orwell, of course, being prime amongst them, foresaw. An extreme, ill-evidenced, anti-libertarian position is called liberal. The merest attempt to see a more balanced picture is considered extreme and illiberal. In one world, even a facial expression is considered by some to be an act of aggression. Meanwhile, actual physical violence against someone who merely disagrees with you is condoned and even approved. I'm speaking of North Korea, of course. But I'm also speaking of here. In this way, the truth is travesty. In the origins of totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt wrote, "The ideal subject of totalitarian rule," I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but I hope I can be heard. "The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between the fact and fiction, i.e. the reality of experience, and the distinction between true and false, i.e. the standards of thought, no longer exist." What I've tried to outline is a vision that explains why what we see when we look at the plight of our modern university is not a number of diverse, unrelated problems, but a coherent predicament that could have been predicted, and by some far-sighted individuals was predicted. We've abandoned a serious search for truth, one in which we must be prepared to find that the truth is other than we've already decided. Otherwise, it is not a search for truth at all. And this state of affairs has come about because we've become heavily dependent on the model of the world offered by our less imaginative, less intelligent, less intuitive, and less reasonable self. A model that favors the machine over the human being, death over life. It is one that is corrosive of what is beautiful, what is good, and what is true, and has no place in it for the sacred. The early 20th century philosopher Max Scheler was much concerned with questions of value. When he died in 1928, Heidegger, who gave his funeral oration, described him as the most potent force in the world of philosophy at the time. Scheler calls the human being ens amans, the being that loves. In its place we have Homo economicus. In the world we live in, reductionist materialism inverts Scheler's perception, and in a thoroughly cynical assessment of what it means to be human, we have exalted the individual ego over all else. It has rendered many virtues, including but not confined to beauty, goodness, and truth, neglected and abandoned. These values, I believe, far from being human inventions, are ontological primitives, since they're aspects of the ground of being itself. Our capacity to respond to them and draw them ever further into being is our privilege and indeed our purpose. We can, of course, also ignore them, devalue them, and cause them to wither away. At what cost to us personally and to the whole of humanity, we can only surmise. Scheler thought there was a hierarchy of values, with those of pleasure and utility, the values of utilitarianism in the left hemisphere, at the lowest level, and rising by stages to that of the holy or sacred, which he considered the highest. A value which I suggest is incomprehensible to the left hemisphere. In between were first the Lebenswerte, or values of life, such as courage, magnanimity, nobility, humility, and loyalty. And then the geistige Werte, the values of mind or spirit, such as beauty, goodness, and truth, which I suggest are better understood by the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere's raison d'etre, being, power, and control, it naturally puts values of utility and hedonism, those of the lowest rank in Scheler's pyramid, first. I may be wrong, but it's my distinct impression that there's been a decline in courage, loyalty, nobility, and humility in our society. Indeed, in all behaviour that carries its costs up front, rather than concealing its sting in the tail. Speaking the truth takes courage, and it would seem that those in the institutions of government, science, and the universities would rather conform than confront untruth. The powerhouses of intellect, the universities, have lost their nerve and become passive, conformist, and feeble, and excessively bureaucratic. Perhaps because of this, I can't help noticing that many of the most interesting ideas in science, in politics, and in philosophy these days come from outside the major institutions, something I note only with the greatest of regret as someone who always saw himself as a proud beneficiary of their ancient traditions and who wished to further those traditions. And along with the loss of courage to speak the truth, there has been an undeniable withdrawal from the beautiful and the sacred. All of this combines to reinforce a loss of sense of purpose and direction, hence the crisis of meaning that it is by now a commonplace that we face. The war on nature and on life is one in which we are inevitably caught up because we are nature, we are life, and we have to decide to be its destroyers or defenders. We have it still in our power to be whichever we choose. I do not have a bullet-pointed agenda, much as the left hemisphere would no doubt like one. Rather, I'm calling for a defense of values that will cost each of us something personally, to name, not acquiesce in, what we know to be untrue, to hold to standards of excellence, to expect much of ourselves, to hold to respect for others, and to listen to points of view with which we disagree, nor only those we endorse, to espouse compassion in place of vehemence and self-righteousness, to embrace humility in the acknowledgement of our necessarily limited understanding, to find once more a sense of wonder in the face of the complex and beautiful cosmos. To do this will help us grow, not stunt our souls. When Solzhenitsyn asked himself what had given rise to the catastrophic brutalities of the 20th century, his conclusion was that men had forgotten God. In a speech given in 1983, he repeated, "If I were called upon to identify briefly the principal trait of the entire 20th century, here too I would be unable to find anything more precise and pithy than to repeat once again, men have forgotten God." More than this, a positive hatred of God, he thought, was the principal driving force behind the philosophy and psychology of Marxism-Leninism. Militant atheism is not merely incidental or marginal to communist policy. It's not a side effect, but the central pivot. I would bring that up to date by pointing out that, sorry if that's a little bit previous. I would like to bring this up to date by pointing out that totalitarianism and extremism no longer manifest among us so much in terms of Marxism-Leninism as in the strident voices of what Matthias Desmet calls mass formation, in which individuals are united not by reason and tolerance, but by propaganda, ideology, and fanatical narratives. This is his great book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism. We must rediscover courtesy and compassion, the virtues of openness and a sense of perspective. But this is another way of seeing. We must stop hating God. The hatred of God is indeed a fascinating phenomenon, one more and more evident in our time, and not just in political philosophies, but in the vox pop of media scientists. Milton saw it all. Lucifer, the bright, the trusted emissary of the master, cannot bear the imputation of anything higher than he. We must make sure he does not win the day. We must hold fast to the dedication of this university. Dominus illuminatio mea. Thank you.
Is this mic on? Yes. Excellent. Anyone who wants to sign up for more of this, not necessarily the same, but more recollection lectures, more of this sort of thing, please give us your email address and permission to send you some information on it. I'll take the prerogative to ask a quick question, and then Jessica will take a mic round for those who would like to ask questions, and that is, if what you're saying is true, should I sign up to medically lobotomize my left hemisphere?
No, there is nothing wrong with the left hemisphere. As I say, it's my second favourite hemisphere. But no, seriously, it is exceptionally important. It is the trusted emissary, and the only problem is when it betrays that trust. In other words, it does important work. They work together in a master-servant relationship, but the servant must never think that it is the master. It easily does, because it knows so little compared with the master. It thinks it knows everything.
We have another quick question from George, and then we'll go to the audience.
I was going to ask if fascinating conclusion, of course, I would be very interested in the idea that the problem you described is connected to a rejection of a belief in God or hatred of God. Could you say a bit more about how that leads to a dominance of the left hemisphere, how the rejection of a belief in God or adoration leads to that dominance of the left hemisphere?
I think there are two principal ways. One is that I didn't really have time to expand on it, but I think I suggested that the way of thinking, the way of being of the left hemisphere makes it more or less impossible for it to compute what we mean when we talk about the divine and the sacred. And the other is its innate hubris. Effectively, this is why there are myths, not just the amazing story of Paradise Lost, which is such a brilliant evocation of this, but all around the world there are stories of a master and the servant usurped the master, and the whole thing fell apart. So we know that people everywhere resonate to this idea that there is something in us that is, as it were, less intelligent, but is angry and wants to take control.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your talk. Perhaps with regard to your concluding remarks about hatred of God, and that in Marxism and Leninism, you have this, that's at the core of Marxism and Leninism, this hatred of God. I would even argue it's not just atheism or militant atheism in Marxism and Leninism, but it's actually they are theomachists.
It's no word.
Theomachists, fighters against God,
No.
battlers against God.
Oh, theomachists, yes.
Yes, that is really at the center. And you probably know that Marx in his early writings would sign them with Emmanuel, but spelled backwards.
For some reason it's very muffled for me, I'm not picking it up, so you can relate it to me in words.
And Marx would sign his early letters with Emmanuel but spelled backwards.
Oh, right.
And you know what it means, taking a holy name and reading it backwards, or a prayer, reading it backwards. So that's right at the center. So they are theomachists, not just militant atheists.
Quite interesting. Thank you very much for that. I didn't know that.
Raise your hand if you'd like to. Oh, wait, there's some ladies there who are interested in jumping in. No, just the third row.
Thank you. I may not have kept up with...
Try to speak loudly directly into the mic if you can.
I may have missed a bit, but I don't quite understand, why does totalitarianism want to get rid of nature and life altogether?
I don't think it's as thought through as that. It's just that the way of thinking that leads to totalitarianism is a very limited, very rigid, schematic, linear, and something coming here. Way of thinking which really has no use for nature except as a resource. And it's confronted by the limitations of the body. Thank God, our bodies are both portals to many wonderful things, but also impose certain kinds of limitations on us. But it will brook no limitation. It will be God. It will be the one that calls all the shots. And so the fact that we die, and the fact that we have, God, I can't even say this nowadays, that males and females have different kinds of bodies. Even these things have to be annulled, see? So children are being brainwashed into believing all kinds of things. If there is a society that exists in the future, I think they'll look back on us and laugh. I mean, think, what these people really thought, said these things, just as some people now look back at the 17th century, So there we are.
I wondered if you could say a few things about modern psychiatry and how it fits into your picture of the world, and also if time to comment on left-handers.
Some of the problems in psychiatry, did you say?
Well, some comment.
Yes. There's so much that could be said, and a lot of it I've said, but in writing at great length. Psychiatry is too big a topic to sort of answer, in a simple. Yeah. Left-handedness is not really my particular concern, but I tackle this in the very first few pages of The Master and His Emissary, and I point out that logically there are three possibilities. Either the left-hander has the brain exactly standard issue, like the right-handed person, and these all exist, or they have the complete inverse, so everything that normally you say right, you say left, or much more commonly there is a sort of mix of things going on. It's very difficult to generalize about left-handers. They are a much less homogeneous group. But what is interesting about left-handers is that they are overrepresented at the bottom and the top of almost all scales of skill and achievement. So, you know, there are far more left-handers than you would expect at the top and at the bottom.
A question from a left-hander who wasn't sufficiently offended by anything in the first few chapters, went on to read the whole of the book. In drawing towards your conclusions, you
Could you speak directly
I
to
really
the mic?
can't hear
Directly.
in drawing towards,
Or did I get that wrong?
No, it was not.
I'm a left-hander who managed to get through those chapters and into the rest of the book
Oh, yes.
without being too offended.
Thank you.
My question is, towards the end, as you were concluding, you gave us a call to arms almost for a defence of values that will cost us personally, and you also you said that the servant should never usurp the master, and the hubris of the servant shouldn't triumph. So practically, what can we be doing to answer, to respond to your call to arms?
Yes. Well, yeah. A number of things. I hinted that, first of all, it was something that required an inner answer, not just an answer out there. There are things we do need to do, this is quite true, in the external world. But some of this is about having a different vision of what a human being is and what the world is and how they relate. This is the essential problem. And I believe that even if we could, by some miracle, reverse the destruction of the forest, the poisoning of the seas, the running out of existence of indigenous tribes, all the things that we're busy doing, even if we could, it would profit us nothing, because we would still be the same entitled, power-hungry, dissatisfied, miserable specimens of humanity that we've made ourselves by this left hemisphere allegiance. So there are bullet points, and you know, sometimes if pressed, I give a few. You know, just it's like, oh, all right, here, have a biscuit. But you know, the left hemisphere loves, you know, God, there's something going wrong. We need 6 bullet points. We've done them. Or we'll be well. Or we'll not be well, because it's not about doing things. It's about being somebody different. We need humanity to have a great wake-up call. And I actually now believe that, you know, I'm not a Bible thumper or anything of this kind, but I now have come to see that, in fact, unless there is a returning to the idea that there is more in this universe than we understand, that there is something divine there that is allied to love and beauty and complexity, that unless we see that, we are lost.
We have time for 2 more questions, perhaps Rebecca, and then the fellow there who has his hand up. Yes.
Thank you so much. I think you started answering my question in your last response, but one of the things that came to mind when you were speaking is that from a practical perspective, what do you believe psychiatry brings to the practical application of what you're saying? So for example, the role of the body, the role of emotional self-regulation, for example, practical things that people can do to get out of a state which is excessively kind of icky and argumentative and dominating. It seems that language is very central to that, and so to some extent to respond by arguments almost seems counterproductive. You know, holding presence, helping people be able to express that anger in ways. As a psychiatrist, would you not say that if someone came to you and they were very angry, you wouldn't address that anger by trying to stop it or trying to argue them out of it? And in that sense, is it, you know, fighting injustice not just with justice, but with love? And what kinds of practices might we be doing to have conversations in a different way rather than
Yes.
more complex arguments?
Look, you raised a very good point. I agree with that. What you're really saying is confrontation is not the best way to make progress. I believe that we now, because that is the way the left hemisphere does things, it attacks, that is now the way we are trying to solve things. However, my view is that we need, everything is an encounter. Everything is an encounter. Relation is at the bottom of existence. Everything that exists is fundamentally relational. So if we lose relations, if we alienate, you're in that group, I'm in this group, we can't talk. This is the most terrible thing we can do. We need to, as I say, get back to a kind of reasonableness, a kind of kindness, a kind of, not going wishy-washy about what you believe, but saying, well, that's very interesting. I have thought about that, but I always come up with this. What do you think about that? There is a way of modelling a conversation. And I sometimes think that almost everybody should have to do couple therapy before they're launched on the world. Because in couple therapy, there's a very fine technique, which is that two people who can't get on come to you. And you ask one of them to explain something, and the other person butts in and says, no, you'll have your say uninterrupted in a minute. Now let me hear more about what it is you want to say. And then when you turn to the other party, the first thing you say is, what did you just hear your partner say? And that is the most revealing moment. Because then you realize, I wasn't saying that at all. Now, if we could do more of that, if children could leave school having learnt, arbitration skills, how to see both sides of the question. In fact, I think all children should be taught to speak for a certain point and then speak against it. I can make a very good speech in defense of the left hemisphere, but I think that one has to be able to be more flexible than we're trained to be. We're trained to become in this box, in this category. And this categorization is what I think is anti-life and dangerous.
We had one more question there from the gentleman. To your right, Jessica. No, sorry. No, turn around. Toward me. Just straight ahead. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for everything. I've got capability to ask plenty of questions, and I'm just going to pick one which I hope will be useful to this audience. Could you say a bit about Steven Pinker and the better angels of our nature? And I think that he's a reasonable man, will accept all of our understanding of the horrors of the 20th century. Notwithstanding that, he would like us to feel, on the whole, don't worry quite so much as you invite us to worry. We're working things out. So if anyone who doesn't know the book, perhaps you might just introduce that, and then you can answer my question. Thank you.
I mean, I can't launch a critique of Steven Pinker, but what I think, I don't agree with him. I think that it, again, depends on how you look at things. For example, one point that's constantly made is look at how many people have been raised out of poverty. But actually, when you look at what happened, lots of people who had no income but needed none, who lived in forests in ancient ways that have been sustainable for hundreds of thousands of years, were uprooted and sent into cities where they became very poor wage slaves, but they had a wage, so they'd been lifted out of that category. Everything depends on how you look at what's going on, and Pinker has a rather curious and he's quite polemical actually in the way in which he sees things. Yesterday at a talk I was giving, I quoted his remark that music is about as useful as pornography or cheesecake, which, Stephen, try and understand what music can give. And I find he's clever, but clever in a not very wise way. He makes an argument, but I don't really believe the substance of the other.